Hi there. It's May 29th, and we continue our progress through the book of 2 Samuel, when the Hebrew structure of the scriptures is part of the former prophets, the Nevi'im Rishonim, and we come here to chapters 14 and 15. Chapter 14 finds us in the midst of the story of Absalom, who has killed his half-brother Amnon over the rape of Tamar, his half-sister, and Absalom has fled to the land of his grandfather Talmai in Geshur, just northeast of Galilee, so that he doesn't get pursued for the revenge of blood for his brother. And he's there for a number of years, a couple of years, and the King David, although he's overcome his mourning, he's overcome his grief for his son Amnon, he's still mourning in his heart for Absalom. Throughout these chapters, we see there's something very charismatic about Absalom in the worldly sense of that, in the popularity sense of that word. Absalom is a very good-looking man. He's very accomplished. He's very personable, and he has a way of connecting with people. And particularly, David's commander Joab sees David's heart grieving over the loss of Absalom, seeing the loss of having him around, and he wants to try and get him back. So he thinks up a ruse, and he actually goes to a woman in Tekoa. She's called Isha Chachma, a wise woman, and he goes to her and he asks her to help him get Absalom back. And she comes and she basically tells the king a story. She makes a fiction up that she has had two sons, one of whom has killed the other, and now her family want to take vengeance on the killer. But if this happens, then she's going to be without family. She's going to be without future. She's going to be without support. David says this won't happen, but as the story goes on, David realizes that this is Joab's work, and he faces the woman up with the question, Joab's had a hand in this, hasn't he? And the woman says, oh, you're so wise. Yes, that's true. And so Joab comes to David and says, look, let's call Absalom back. And so David calls Absalom back. He allows him to come and take up his residence again without being pursued. And what happens then is that for 2 years there's no contact between Absalom. And in the end, Absalom is tired of this, and he actually sends for Joab, to use Joab as an intermediary between him and the king. After all, it was Joab who enabled him to come back. But Joab refuses to come. So Absalom takes a very extreme position, and he ends up burning some of Joab's fields so that Joab will come and speak to Absalom. And Absalom says, look, you haven't called me to the king, please go and intercede with the king, which Joab does. And then Absalom and King David actually reconcile, and they come together and they make up. However, going into chapter 15, this charismatic nature of Absalom really comes to the fore. Absalom has himself a small troop, a small army. He goes to the gates of the city, which is where judgments are given, where legal disputes were settled, and he begins to use his influence and to make himself popular with the people. And actually it says in this chapter that he stole away the hearts of Israel. The word stole, ganav, here means he took something that didn't belong to him. There's a usurping going on. And so eventually his popularity gets to the point where he goes with a troop of men to Hebron, which is actually where David started off, if you remember, in Judah. And in Hebron he is proclaimed king. And this news gets back to David. David realizes that he is going to have to get out of town. After all, if Absalom didn't spare his heir, there's no reason he would spare the old king, and so he hightails it out of town. Except that he's accompanied by a number of Gittites, people who came from Gath originally, who came from the Philistine area. And he says, look, you go away. I don't want you coming with me. You're exiles like me. I don't want to make you share in my fate. But the Gittites say, no, we will not we will not go back from following you. We have made covenant with you. And they speak of Hesed and Emet. They speak of this covenant obligation and of faithfulness. And so David, in the midst of this terrible time, experiences people who still want to be faithful and true with him. Going back to the story in 2 Samuel 14 of Absalom's return, there's something interesting here, that the woman in her story says something to David that is quite powerful. She actually says, we all have to die like water spilled on the ground that can't be picked up again. But God doesn't take our life away. Rather, he has worked out a way for the exile not to remain in exile away from him. This theme of exile is something that's very strong in the scriptures. It's also strong still among Jewish people today. In fact, one of the blessings that is said during the blessings of the daily prayers, 3 times a day prayers of Israel, says, Baruch atah Adonai mechabetz nidche amo Yisrael. Blessed are you, Lord, who gathers the exiles, who gathers those who've been made in exile of your people Israel. And so this calling back from exile is something that's very strong, and it's this that the woman appeals to. God doesn't keep us in exile forever. There's something very strong here for us who follow Jesus as Messiah, that we who were once distant, Paul says, now have been brought near by the blood of Jesus. Once we were foreigners to this covenant of grace, now we are brought home by the grace of God. We can be thankful for that today, that we're no longer exiles, but made children of the living God. Have a very good May the 29th.